Okay, well, good morning and welcome to Avoiding Plagiarism and Self-Plagiarism. It's the latest webinar from the Department of Scientific Publications. My name is Joe Munch. I'm an editor in the department, and with me today is
Stephanie Deming.
So today we're going to focus on how to avoid plagiarizing others and yourself. When we edit manuscripts and teach writing workshops, we find that authors sometimes don't know the best practices for incorporating previously published ideas into new manuscripts. So authors have a lot of questions about reusing their own previously published text, and today we're going to give you some helpful strategies for including previously published material in new manuscripts without committing plagiarism. Now, if you have any questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat room, and we'll take a break about midway through this presentation to answer any questions, and again at the end. We'll also post a recording of this webinar to our department's intranet site, so if you've missed anything, you can always go back and rewatch it later. Okay, and with that, I'm going to bid adieu to the video and go ahead and get started. So here's what we're going to cover today. We'll share some definitions of plagiarism, explain why it is wrong, and we'll talk about some of the consequences of plagiarizing. We'll talk about how plagiarism is detected, and just a quick spoiler alert here, it's easier than ever. And we're going to focus on some practical tips for avoiding plagiarism. Now we'll round out our presentation by going into some greater detail about the concepts of self-plagiarism and text recycling. So basically, plagiarism is taking someone else's work and presenting it as your own. Not only text, but also figures and tables and other types of original material can be plagiarized. But in this presentation, we will focus on what it means to plagiarize text and how to avoid doing so. Here are some more precise types of plagiarism. Now, copying word for word without enclosing the copy material in quotation marks and crediting the original author is one type of plagiarism. You might call this straight-up plagiarism. Now, this is when an author copies a sentence, paragraph, or section of text from another paper and pastes it into his or her own manuscript, such that it appears that the author wrote it him or herself. Copying some words and phrases and interspersing them with the author's own ideas without distinguishing between the two or crediting the original author is another form of plagiarism. This is sometimes called mosaic plagiarism. And in this case, instead of copying a solid block of text and passing it off as his or her own, the author takes phrases or entire sentences from one source, two sources, three sources, and so forth, and he or she plants them here and there among his or her own writing in the manuscript. Now finally, self-plagiarism is the reuse of one's own previously published text without attribution to the original source. This is also known as text recycling, and we're going to talk about it in greater depth later in this webinar. Why is plagiarism not allowed? Well, put simply, plagiarism is not allowed because it is dishonest to present someone else's ideas as your own. But it's also not allowed because it may also violate copyright law. Most journals own the copyright to the articles they publish, and if the journal doesn't own the copyright, then the author does. Now, this means that the journal or author gets to decide what is done with the material. Someone wanting to reuse the material generally must get permission from the copyright holder. Now, so from a moral and legal standpoint, you should not plagiarize. Now, in the highly unlikely event that you scoff at scruples and laugh at the law, please also consider that plagiarizing has some real consequences. What are those consequences? Well, you might lose face with colleagues. You could find yourself in legal hot water, and that's usually accompanied by financial consequences. You might also find it more difficult to get your work published. For example, a journal that caught you plagiarizing may not allow you to submit any papers for a certain period. And you might face academic penalties like not getting promoted or, in egregious cases of plagiarism, getting fired. Now, journals take plagiarism seriously, and they say so in the editorial policies they post on their websites. For example, Cancer Research will reject the work or retract it if it's already been published, and may notify the author's institution or funding agency. The Journal of Surgical Oncology will reject or retract the work, tell the author's institution, and bar the author from submitting to the journal again. Now, they go on to say that they'll even share the news of the author's misconduct with other journals the author has published in. So journals are increasingly and actively on the lookout for plagiarism. Now, how do they detect plagiarism? Well, in many cases, the author whose work has been plagiarized will notice it. But there are some other ways plagiarism can be detected by non-authors. Now, close reading can uncover plagiarism. For example, a reader comes across a familiar passage, holds it up against the original source, and spots plagiarism. Search engines can also be used to detect plagiarism. Now, you can cut and paste a passage into Google, and if the text has already been published, it will almost invariably appear at the top of the search results. A third method, which is gaining popularity among journals, is the use of web-based plagiarism detecting programs. Let's talk about those. Most journals are using plagiarism detecting programs to check all submissions. The most common program used by journals and book publishers is iThenticate. It works like this. iThenticate compares the manuscripts with a vast database of online sources. The manuscript stays private. It is not loaded into the database. iThenticate calculates percentage of the text that overlaps with that of previously published material, and it generates a report marking that text and linking it to the original sources. Now, at MD Anderson, we have free access to iThenticate through the Research Medical Library. And when you send a manuscript to scientific publications for editing, we will check it as a service to you. Now, that's not to say we're playing the plagiarism police. We're just trying to help you spot any problematic text before it goes to the publisher. You can also get your own account by contacting the library. So after an article has been run through iThenticate, someone at the journal will review the report for issues that need addressing, especially if the total percentage of overlap is more than a certain threshold, such as 25%. Now, we've heard that some journals will reject a manuscript outright if it has an overlap of 50% or more. However, the percentage is not an absolute indicator of whether plagiarism has occurred. Now, we've seen manuscripts with overall overlaps of more than 30% that did not contain any questionable passages, and we've seen a manuscript with an overall overlap of only 11% that had some text that needed some substantial revision and citation. So it's important to interpret the iThenticate reports carefully. One reason for this is that iThenticate will mark some phrases that are so common that they don't really belong to anyone and can't really be plagiarized. Sentences like, "This clinical trial was approved by our institutional review board," and p-values of less than 0.05 were considered significant, are found in many manuscripts, and they're not problematic. But iThenticate will flag them anyway, thereby increasing the overlap percentage. But if there is an overlap in distinctive phrasing, or if the overlap consists of a full sentence or longer, the journal staff will take a closer look. They will assess the extent of the overlap, the source of the original text, the copyright status, and whether the original publication is cited. Whether and how to address the overlap often comes down to judgment calls rather than hard and fast rules, so different journals will handle the overlap in different ways. One journal might consider a sentence that overlaps 80% of a previously published sentence to be problematic. Another journal might just consider the repetition of 5 or 6 consecutive words of a previously published phrase to be an issue. Well, here's an example of an iThenticate report. On the left is a made-up statistical analysis paragraph. Now, do you see the highlighted, colored highlighting? This indicates the text that overlaps the literature. A different color and number are used to mark each original source of the text, and the sources are listed at right and linked to the original articles online. Now, notice the percentage at the top right of the screen. iThenticate found that 77% of the paragraph overlapped with other documents in this case. Now, looking more closely at this paragraph, we see that this type of language would show up in lots of articles. In this case, iThenticate just picked out a few articles. There's nothing unique about how this information is written. This is an example of the type of overlap that is not a problem because it consists of standardized phrases. Often, straightforward information like this that can't be phrased many other ways appears in the method sections. Let's look at an example where overlap would be a problem. In this example, we're looking at 3 versions of the same information given in a training module on plagiarism posted on the website of the U.S. Office of Research Integrity. For the top version, we copied text directly from the ORI website and pasted it into our own document. We ran that document through iThenticate, which of course flagged all the text as having been previously published. Now for the middle version, we took the original text from the ORI website and omitted and switched out a few words here and there. iThenticate flagged most of the text, but it did not flag the substituted words. Now let's take a closer look at that. When you click on the highlighted text, you can see the text of the original source. You can easily see which words from the original have been changed here and there, and that the ideas in most of the text remain the same as in the original. This is an example of what we would call a poor paraphrase of the original source, and it would be considered plagiarized text. Now, for the bottom version, we completely rewrote the ORI text in our own words, and iThenticate did not flag it as overlapping previously published material. Although the wording is new, the ideas are still from the original text. So a citation, reference 1, has been added. We will talk more about how to avoid plagiarizing in a moment, but for now we just wanted to show you that plagiarism detecting software really makes it easy to see whether the text is original. Okay, so plagiarism is wrong, and the consequences of plagiarizing can be harsh, and detecting plagiarism is easier than ever. So why does it happen? Well, plagiarism doesn't often happen because someone has an actual desire to cheat. The reasons people plagiarize, on purpose or not, are often much more innocuous and totally avoidable. Sometimes people commit plagiarism because they have not planned their writing time well. Now, we all find ourselves up against deadlines from time to time, and there can be a temptation to get a lot of work done quickly by simply copying some text from a source. It's fast and it's easy, but as we've seen, it's also pretty fast and easy to catch plagiarism nowadays. So managing your time, planning plenty of time to write before deadlines, and taking the time to double check your work are all essential strategies for avoiding unintentional plagiarism. Now, sloppy note-taking is another potential avenue to inadvertent plagiarism. In the past few years, several famous authors have been caught publishing text that has been duplicated from their sources. Now, the writers explained that they had taken notes on the source material when they first read it, and by the time they sat down to write up their research, months or years later, they didn't realize that what they were copying from their notes had itself been copied from the sources word for word. Now, that's a plausible explanation for the plagiarism, but it doesn't excuse it. And in this case, if anything, this should serve as a lesson that you should write your notes in your own words, and similarly, avoid copying and pasting text from original sources into your own manuscript. Okay, so a lack of awareness about the principles, rules, and stakes involved in publishing can also contribute to plagiarism. For example, copyright law is a complex field, and few people other than specialized lawyers really understand it well. And as science and medicine become increasingly globalized, people from all different parts of the world are working together more and more. And local norms and practices surrounding acceptable copying, borrowing, and reusing of text can differ from one place to another. So people can be a little unsure as to what's acceptable. Now, finally, sometimes people run afoul of plagiarism rules because they are unsure of how to avoid duplicating text. For example, many people are not sure of how and when to cite a source, and many authors are not confident in their ability to paraphrase or summarize others' words. If someone else has made a point very well, how can you say it differently? Well, let's talk about that now. And let's start with how you can avoid plagiarism, since the strategies are straightforward. Now, the first and most important strategy for avoiding plagiarism is to always cite the original sources of the information you're using. You can also quote original passages directly to avoid plagiarism. However, aside from in a few special cases, the use of direct quotation is seldom used in scientific writing because too much direct quotation might cause your readers to question your grasp of the material you're presenting. A much more common way of avoiding plagiarism is using summarizing and paraphrasing, which we'll talk about now. Now, both summarizing and paraphrasing involve rephrasing original passages using your own words. However, whereas summarizing presents just the main idea of the original material, paraphrasing presents most of the details of the original material. Which technique you use depends on what you want to say. If details are not important, or if you want to give your readers just a broad overview of the information, you should summarize. But if you need your readers to understand the specific details of what you're referring to, like if you're conveying the specific results and conclusions of a key study, you should paraphrase. A summary is typically shorter than the original passage, whereas a paraphrase is usually about the same length as the original passage. Of course, regardless of whether you are summarizing or paraphrasing, you must cite the original source material. So let's take a closer look at how to summarize. Now we're going to offer what we think is a fairly straightforward approach to summarizing. First, make sure you have a good understanding of the source material. Read through it carefully, taking care to identify key words and ideas. And once you've made it a point to learn the new information, to internalize it, it becomes much easier to convey that information in your own words. Now, if I were to ask you, for example, how oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the lungs, you'd probably be able to tell me in your own words without having to look it up. So once you have a good understanding, think about the main points you want to convey. Next, write down those main points in your own words. Do so, and this is key, without looking at the source material, because the more you look at the source material, the more apt you are to repeat it as you rewrite. Remember to remove the smaller details from the original source and concentrate on giving your reader only a general idea of material. And remember that it's okay to use some of the same key words. Also, a general rule of thumb is that a summary is about 1/4 to 1/3 the length of the original. Finally, compare your text to the original passage. Do they convey the same message and ideas without substantial overlap? Let's take a look at this in practice. Okay, here's our original paragraph. I've highlighted some of the key concepts we might want to summarize. As I read it, notice too that several phrases, perioperative aspirin, venous thromboembolism, non-cardiac surgery, are repeated, which means they're probably important. So here's the passage. Although there is strong evidence that aspirin prevents venous thromboembolism after non-cardiac surgery, physicians more commonly use anticoagulant therapy for the prevention of venous thromboembolism. Nevertheless, 1/3 of patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery who are at risk for major vascular complications receive perioperative aspirin. Among patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery, there is variability in the use of perioperative aspirin, both among patients who are not already taking aspirin and among those who are on long-term aspirin regimens. Uncertainty regarding the risks and benefits of aspirin underscores the need for a large perioperative trial. Okay, got everything internalized? Okay, right. Here's one possible summary. I'll give you a moment to read through it. So at 27 words, it's less than 1/3 the length of the original 91-word passage. The key terms are all here: aspirin, perioperative, thromboembolism, non-cardiac surgery, and the overall message is in keeping with that of the original passage. And of course, the authors of the original passage are cited. But we have cut specific details about evidence for using aspirin to prevent venous thromboembolism, about the proportion of patients who are actually receiving it, and about the variability of its use. Now, in that summary, the only details we really care about conveying are that aspirin can prevent thromboembolism and that there is some uncertainty about the drug's risks and benefits. Let's look at paraphrasing now. So as we saw earlier in the iThenticate example, paraphrasing is not just changing a few words in the passage. That is actually considered plagiarism. Paraphrasing means using different words, using different grammatical structures, and even rearranging the order of ideas from the original passage to convey the most important details of that passage. In many ways, paraphrasing is a lot harder than summarizing. When you summarize, you have to come up with just a few sentences to broadly repeat your source material. But when you paraphrase, you basically have to rewrite the passage, using usually as long or longer than the original, to convey all the essential information to your readers. Now, this can be daunting even for experienced writers. But how you go about paraphrasing a passage is a lot like how you go about summarizing a passage. Again, you need to internalize the information because this will help you think about the information in your own voice and in your own words. You don't need to think about main ideas in this case because you'll need to include the details. Now, when you write your paraphrase, put the original passage aside. Now, if you look at the source material as you paraphrase, the likelihood of inadvertent plagiarism is great. If you're afraid of omitting key details, don't worry. The important thing here is to get as much of the information as possible down in your own words. You can add any missed details later. Finally, compare your paraphrase with the original passage, checking to see if it gives the detailed information of the original without substantially repeating it. If too many content words like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are repeated, or if there are the same number of sentences, or if the connecting words and phrases are similar, some revision is probably in order. So consider these tips when you paraphrase and revise. First, don't fret about finding new ways to say keywords and phrases. It's not just acceptable, but often necessary to use some of the same terms in your paraphrase. You can switch up the grammar a bit. For example, use active voice to describe ideas given in passive voice, or combine ideas given in short sentences into long sentences. You can reorder the ideas in a passage as long as the new order makes sense. And of course, you can use synonyms, but remember that paraphrasing involves more than just switching out a few words for some others. And a combination of these strategies will usually yield a passable paraphrase. Okay, so let's look at that paragraph on aspirin use again. Now this time, our goal is to include all the important details, not just give a broad overview of the information. So refamiliarize yourself with the passage really quick. Okay. Here's one possible paraphrase. The original paragraph has 91 words and the paraphrase has 98, so it is pretty much the same length. There is a slight reordering of the ideas from the original to the paraphrase, but the sentences are also quite different. For example, the original starts with longer sentences and ends with shorter ones. This pattern is reversed in the paraphrase, and necessary words such as venous thromboembolism and aspirin appear in both passages, but most other content words have been changed. And again, the original source is cited. This would be an appropriate paraphrase that would avoid any claim of plagiarism. Okay, so let's take a quick break to answer any questions you might have. There's one. When is it best to paraphrase? When is it best to summarize? Does summarization require citation? Well, it depends. As I very quickly mentioned, if you want to convey all the important details of what you're writing about, so for example, if you want to talk about a key study's findings, in that case, you would want to paraphrase. But if you just want to give kind of an overview of things, if you just want to kind of just mark that key study in your text and say so-and-so found this, then you would summarize. Now, in both cases, it's extremely important to include a citation. Are there any other questions? I might have one more here. Okay, great. I don't see anybody else typing. Thank you, Dolores, for your question. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie. And again, we'll have time for more questions at the end of the presentation. Here is Stephanie.
Okay, so we have two terms at the top of this slide, self-plagiarism and text recycling. Both of these terms refer to reuse of your own previously published text in a new document meant for publication. However, the term self-plagiarism can be problematic. For one thing, some forms of text reuse are perfectly acceptable, and it seems odd to refer to acceptable reuse as plagiarism. Also, plagiarism implies stealing, and it seems odd to speak of stealing from yourself. So we prefer the more neutral term text recycling, and that's what I'll use in the rest of this presentation. Okay. Just one note before I go on. Authors most commonly reuse their text, but the principles regarding text reuse also apply to reuse of previously published tables, figures, and other materials. Sometimes the terms text recycling and duplicate publication get confused. So text recycling means reuse of portions of your own previously published text, just portions. Duplicate publication means publication of very similar full manuscripts. So for example, duplicate publication could be publishing 2 or more almost identical articles or book chapters, or publishing 2 or more articles with essentially the same introduction methods and discussion text, but different results text. And some people choose to think about duplicate publication as an extreme form of text recycling. And duplicate publication is sometimes also called redundant, overlapping, repetitive, or dual publication. Both text recycling and duplicate publication may violate copyright rules. And in addition, duplicate publication is considered unethical for several reasons. First, the existence of 2 published papers with the same results distorts the literature in the field. Second, duplicate publication wastes the time of journal editors, reviewers, and journal staff. And finally, duplicate publication reduces the chance that another author will have his or her work published, because the duplicate publication has used up some of the finite pool of scientific publishing resources. Okay, so let's go back and focus on text recycling. This quotation is from the Office of Research Integrity training module on plagiarism that Joe mentioned earlier. Ethical writing entails an implicit contract between reader and writer, whereby the reader assumes, unless otherwise noted, that the material was written by the individuals listed as authors, and that it is new and is accurate to the best of the author's abilities. So those phrases that we've highlighted, unless otherwise noted and new, are very important. So given these reader expectations that are part of this implicit contract between the author and the readers, authors can get into trouble if they reuse text without making clear to readers and publishers that it isn't new. So if you include text that you've previously published elsewhere, that fact should be made clear to readers. As a general rule, you should try to minimize reusing your own previously published text. However, text recycling is sometimes okay, and we're going to talk about those instances in a minute. Generally, in cases in which text recycling is permitted, you have to do 3 things. You have to make clear that the text is being recycled. You have to indicate where the reused text originally appeared, and you have to obtain any necessary permission to reuse the text. So how do you indicate where the text originally appeared? That's very simple. You just provide a reference. As for permission, you'll need to obtain permission if someone else holds the copyright for the text and you want to reuse a substantial portion of it. In many cases, the publisher of the document in which the text originally appeared will hold the copyright. If the publisher holds the copyright, the publisher owns that text and you must get permission to reuse it. Other publishers hold copyright but automatically grant back to the author the right to reuse text in future articles, as long as the author provides a reference to where the text originally appeared. Still, other publishers leave copyright with the author, in which case the author can reuse his or her own text without getting permission, but should still disclose the previous use. So to find out what rules apply in your particular case, you can check the publishing agreement. Now let's look at when reuse of your own previously published text is and is not permitted in different kinds of documents. We're going to start with grant proposals. In this situation, recycling your own text is okay because grant proposals are not published. When we say that they're not published, we mean that they're not meant for public dissemination. They're confidential documents that will be read only by a small group of reviewers. And because they are private, not published documents, there's no need to make clear that your text is being reused. There's no need to cite the original source, although usually you will. And there's no need to obtain permission from the copyright holder. It's important to remember here that we're talking about reuse of your own previously published text. In the rare case in which you want to include someone else's previously published text in a grant proposal, you should put that text in quotation marks, or paraphrase or summarize it, and provide a reference indicating where it originally appeared. Now let's talk about scientific articles. What if you previously reported your work in abstract or poster form, and now you're reporting the work in a full scientific article? This is a very common situation. Some journals ask that the abstract or poster be mentioned on the title page of the manuscript or in the cover letter. And to learn if this is necessary, check the instructions to authors for the journal you plan to submit to. Even if the journal doesn't require it, some authors like to mention it in their cover letter anyway. One reason to do so is to give the journal a heads up that the published abstract may increase the percentage overlap detected by iThenticate or another plagiarism detection software. And by convention, there's no need to cite the abstract or poster as a reference, and there's no need to obtain permission from the publisher. Now let's talk about reusing text that was previously published in a full article. In the introduction and discussion sections, text recycling is generally not permitted. You should present ideas using new words and cite references as needed. And if text must be reused, you would place the text in quotation marks and provide a reference. In the methods section, some text recycling may be okay. Reuse of some methods text is permitted because methods have to be detailed enough to allow replication of the experiment, and also because changing the description of a complex procedure could change the meaning. For common procedures, though, it's better to reference the article where the method was originally described and then provide only basic details of the procedure in the new article. Okay. But if you need to recycle text in the methods section, here are the rules. By convention, recycled methods text does not need to be placed in quotation marks. But when the reused text is substantial, you should cite the original paper. So for example, let's imagine that you previously described in detail a specially designed apparatus that you used for mouse behavioral experiments, and you want to reuse that description in a new paper. This is how you could handle it in the new paper. The mouse behavioral experiments were performed using our specially designed apparatus. Then you would provide a reference indicating where this was originally described. And then you could go on and use recycled text to describe the procedure. So mice were placed in a box, and then you could go on and describe the rest of it using text that you are recycling from your previous paper. And that would be okay because this is the method section. Or another example, if you performed a pilot study and then a full study using similar methods, you could say, as we described previously for our pilot study, and then provide a reference. And then you could go on and in detail describe those methods using recycled text. In the case when the methods section of a paper overlaps substantially with the methods section of one of your earlier papers, it may be appropriate to note that fact in the cover letter. In the results section, republication of results constitutes duplicate publication unless. So let's pause here for a minute. Remember that we talked about duplicate publication earlier? So this term encompasses publishing the same or substantially the same results more than once, which distorts the literature. So basically, in the results section, you would not duplicate results unless there's a compelling rationale. For example, maybe the article is an update of an earlier report, and you make clear that some results are repeated. So for example, this analysis includes 21 patients originally described in our 2000 report, and you would provide a reference, and 24 new patients treated at our institution during 2000 to 2016. So there you're making clear to the readers that some of the results in this paper already appeared in your earlier paper, but it's okay because there's a compelling rationale for doing that, and you've explained exactly what you're doing. Sometimes you will use the same basic sentence structure in the results section of more than one paper. This is totally fine. These are sentences like the ones that Joe pointed out earlier, where if plagiarism detection software flagged them, they would actually not be any problem. Sentences like, patient characteristics are summarized in table X. You could see that sentence in a lot of papers, and its repetition wouldn't be any problem. Or, major postoperative complications were observed in X patients, and minor postoperative complications were observed in Y patients. Finally, let's talk about book chapters and review articles. Experts like the ones at MD Anderson are often asked to write multiple book chapters or review articles on the same topic. However, for reasons that we described before, readers and publishers of book chapters and review articles generally expect new text. Furthermore, it's generally considered poor practice for an author to publish 2 book chapters or review articles with essentially the same scope and content, even if the author uses different text. Readers and publishers expect each of an author's publications to represent a unique contribution to the literature. So if an author writes 2 articles on the same general topic, there should be some clear difference between them. So, for example, an author could write a review article about immunotherapy for melanoma in the year 2017, and then write another review article on immunotherapy for melanoma in the year 2019, after new studies have been published that change the state of the field, because presumably those 2 articles, published 2 years apart, would differ in terms of the specific studies that were reviewed and the recommendations for clinical practice. Or an author could write 2 articles about the same general topic, but with different focuses. For example, a book chapter on multidisciplinary treatment and outcomes in patients with cervical cancer, and a separate book chapter on how to perform laparoscopic surgery for early-stage cervical cancer. But back to the situation in which you're asked to write 2 articles on the same topic. What should you do? Well, instead of trying to rewrite your previously published text, decline to write 2 articles on the same topic. You could ask to change the topic or change the scope of the second article so that it doesn't include themes that you've already published on. Or you have a couple of other options. You could have a colleague co-author the chapter and have that person start from scratch. Or finally, you could request permission from the new publisher and the original publisher to adapt the original chapter or article. And to adapt something means to reuse substantial portions of the original, but also add new material. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, but we wonder if you have additional questions. On this slide that's showing now, we've listed some of the key sources that we used. And as Joe mentioned earlier, we'll be posting the webinar, so it will be accessible to you in the future, the recording. But does anyone have any questions right now?
So everybody's well educated in plagiarism and how to avoid it then? Wonderful. Okay, well, I don't see anybody typing, so I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Just a few quick contact information bits here. We will post a recording of this webinar to our internet site shown here at the top, mdanderson.org/departments/SciPub. You can reach us at 713-792-3305 if you have any questions or would like to talk to an editor. We can also be reached by email. I see that someone's typing. We have a question. We're also located in 1MC. We're here for you, so please come up and give us a visit if you like.
All right.
Okay, and typing has stopped. So with that, I guess we're going to wish you a good day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.